trails and ghost towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts, and with me is Bill Barlee, who's led us on stories through British Columbia, Northern Washington, the Yukon, Alberta. Today we're going to talk about a man who we've alluded to in programs in the past, but never given him his due.
Yeah, he was called, Mike, the biggest man, the best-looking man, and the damnedest man who ever came over the Caribou Road. And
Minor?
No, sir. Judge Matthew Bailey Begbie.
That's pretty gentle words. Who was the one who referred to him in such sort of...
Well, the miners generally referred to him in those terms, and they also referred to him in another term, Mike. They called him the hanging judge, and I think probably that's fairly accurate. You know, in his career, in a given few years, of about 12 or 13 years, he condemned 52 men to death, 27 of them hanged, and when you compare that with the rest of Canada in the 1860s and 1870s, the rest of Canada hanged under half that number. So that Matthew Bailey Begbie did hang a number of individuals, and I'm not too convinced that he was one of the greatest judges in British Columbia, because he seemed to have a tendency to hang the Indians. Out of those 27 men who were hanged, 22 were Indians, and only four were Occidentals, and one was Chinese. And I think it was imbalance on Begbie's part. Now, you know, when you look at Begbie, very interesting background. He was born in Mauritius, which was a British colony, an island, and in 1819. His father inherited, Mike, a large estate in England, and his father was a military man, and that enabled Begbie to follow his trail pretty well, and he decided to become a lawyer at an early age and went to Trinity College in Cambridge, which of course is one of the leading colleges of England along with Oxford, and Trinity of course is the leading college of that university.
Yeah.
And he was known as the strongest man in Trinity College and in Cambridge, which is kind of interesting. Now, here was a guy who towered over 6 feet tall, was a good athlete evidently in his youth, and was strong as a horse. And he was also an excellent scholar. He really was superb, first-rate scholar.
What a man. Was he a classically trained scholar? I mean, was he a man who knew everything about everything, or a great deal about many things?
Well, yeah, he knew about everything. He was trained in mathematics and Latin and Greek, and he spoke 5 different languages, really. He spoke Greek and was conversant in Latin, French, German, and of course English. And eventually, when he came out to British Columbia, he knew Chinook, which was the Indian dialect, extremely well. So that this guy went on and really was a fine lawyer in London, and then a chance came up, and a chance which he really couldn't miss. And the chance was in one of the British colonies at that time called British Columbia. So in 1858, he was offered a job in British Columbia, and he didn't hesitate, Mike.
Okay. Take a break here, but when we come back, we'll take a look at what he did as soon as he got into British Columbia, and he encountered a great many different situations, so we'll do that right after this break. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Today we're taking a look at the life and times of Sir Matthew Bailey Begbie. Arrives in, I guess, New Caledonia up until 1858.
Yep.
What
British Columbia
job?
and New Caledonia, Vancouver Island.
Yeah.
Well, his job was to bring justice to the gold fields, actually. And what had happened, Mike, was this, of course. We've touched on this previously, but there were thousands and thousands of American miners in British Columbia in 1858. And they came with kind of a rough form of frontier justice. In fact, there's an old poem, Mike, that says it all, what they thought of the judicial system and what they thought specifically of jails. And what they thought was this. They said, and this ditty comes from California, they said, canvas roof and paper walls, 20 horse thieves in the stalls. But I did what I had done before. I coyoted out from beneath the floor.
Just tunneled out of justice. It was a bad holding system, and not many people face justice ever.
Almost impossible. If an American committed a murder in British Columbia, all he had to do was go down the Fraser River and across the line into Washington State and Washington Territory at that time.
And avoid justice.
Sure.
So Begbie's job was to tighten the screws on justice.
Begbie's job was partly to tighten the screws on justice and also to offset the American influence in the gold fields. And the Americans were looking through their Manifest Destiny era, and this was part of it, at taking over all the British possessions on the west coast of North America, which included Vancouver Island and British Columbia.
Yeah. And they would do that just by sheer numbers. As you said,
oh, sure.
Thousands of American miners flooded in, making this American territory by population.
That's right. 90% of those white miners in British Columbia were Americans, mostly Californians, some from Oregon, some from Washington, some from other parts of the United States. And what had happened prior to, just prior to Begbie landing in British Columbia was the so-called Ned McGowan War. And that was an insurrection, really, on Hales Bar, which is just south of Yale. And this is where an American group of miners who were pretty roughly hewn. In fact, they were given short term by the vigilantes of San Francisco to head out of California, which they did, and they landed up in British Columbia and almost took over there. It was very, very close, and it meant that Sir James Douglas had to bring in the Marines and bring in considerable force to put down this insurrection.
And did James Douglas, do you think, say, we need a good lawyer, a good solid man to take over the judiciary to handle this here, and Begbie was his man? Yeah,
he was ideally suited. You know, here was a guy who liked the frontier in those first years. He looked... People liked him. He was a very imposing guy. He was big, as I mentioned before. He was raw-boned. He was a good athlete. And he came in at 800 pounds a year. Now, 800 pounds, Mike, is about $4,000 then. That would be equivalent to $120,000 now. And also another provision, his horse had to be taken care of as well.
Well-fed, well-paid,
sure,
and well-educated.
Yeah.
Despite the potential flaws of, as you pointed out at the beginning, of
sure,
maybe hanging too many Indians.
Yeah.
One of the first cases, of course, I guess, is associated with an uprising, a massacre.
Yeah, well, this is the so-called Chilcotin War, and also called the Waddington Massacre, and this takes place in the early 1860s, and this indicates a flaw to me in Begbie's character. And I could be incorrect, but I think it is, because what happened in the Chilcotin district, the whites were going to put a road through there, and the Indians of that area had been decimated, were deathly afraid of smallpox. And there's not much doubt that there had been smallpox in the area brought in by the whites. And the Indians felt that this was their fault, and therefore they weren't going to allow this road crew. And the road crew had been given warning. An Indian woman actually had warned them that they were going to be attacked, and they discounted it entirely. And the Indians attacked, the Chilcotin Indians attacked, and wiped out practically the entire road crew. And so the result was, of course, that they brought in a guy called W.G. Cox, who was a gold commissioner and kind of a circuit judge, who had been appointed by Begbie at Quesnel Mouth. He came in here, and he managed to trick the Indians into surrendering. And the Indians who surrendered, and it's very interesting when you read the bench notes in this, Mike, that the Indians told the truth right through it. And nevertheless, because they told the truth, Begbie wanted to make an example of them. So he brought 6 of them to trial in Quesnel Mouth, which is now the city of Quesnel, and he hanged 5 of them, including an Indian called Telut, who probably did not participate in the murders or the killings. And so I found it very, very questionable. And the chief, who was a guy called Clatacine, was also tricked into surrendering. Mm-hmm. And the bench notes are exceptionally interesting. And 5 out of the 6 Indians were hanged. The other one turned crown evidence, and he wasn't. But it was not unusual for Begbie to do this. And there's no doubt that I think the whites were at fault in this, because there is, if you looked over the later issues of the Victoria Daily Colonist at that time, you'll see there were warnings printed in there that anyone selling the infected blankets to the Indians will be severely dealt with.
There's a smallpox inflicted.
That's right.
And they figured that they were doing that in this area. There was just cause for some sort of insurrection there.
Yeah.
But it had the effect, of course, of quelling any native uprisings, and that was standard in North America at the time.
And so we can take a look at this photo of Begbie. And this is a photo of Begbie as he would appear when he first came into British Columbia, Mike. And there he is, over 6 feet tall, probably weighing about 210 pounds, and lives up to his reputation, really.
Getting those piercing eyes glaring at you from the bench.
But he was high-handed, Mike. Yeah. He was autocratic. And he really... some of his decisions are most questionable, and when the jury did not agree with him, and there's a in this book here, which is excellent book on Matthew Bailey Begbie.
I had a chance to talk with David Williams a man for a new country, and
Yeah.
that's where you're quoting a considerable amount
Yes,
of the
there's some information in here we are using from this and some other information as well. And I think that David Williams may have a slightly jaundiced view, and that David is a lawyer, and he likes Begbie, and I can see the reasons why, but I can also see some flaws in Begbie's character. And one of these flaws, I think, is indicated on page 144.
Yeah, several of the cases. Which case do you want to start out
Well,
with?
I think what we should do is start out with a case of an individual who they had concocted a scheme. And this is a guy in Williams Lake at this time, and his name was Gilchrist. He was an American miner in 1862. And they hated a guy called Turner, Mike. And so they said, how can we kill Turner without getting caught? Well, they thought he got together with a friend of his, a Confederate, and they thought they would have a mock quarrel. And they both draw guns. And then somebody would grab Gilchrist's hand, and in the ensuing struggle, he would take aim at Turner and shoot him dead. Well, they did all this. They went through the whole scene, and they missed Turner and killed another guy.
Oh dear.
And
so double deer.
That's right. So what happened, of course, is that the jury was impaneled, and they sat down before Begbie, and they came back with not a murder verdict, as Begbie felt it was obviously a murder verdict. They came back with manslaughter. And here's what he says to the jury, and he really reams the jury out. He says this: "It is far from a pleasant duty for me to have to sentence you only to imprisonment for life." He's talking to Gilchrist.
Yeah.
"I feel I am, through some incomprehensible reason, preventing from doing my proper duty." He wanted to give him the death sentence. And then in a voice of thunder, "Your crime was unmitigated, diabolical murder. You deserve to be hanged. Had the jury performed their duty, I might now have the painful satisfaction of condemning you to death. And you, gentlemen of the jury," this is what he goes on, "you are a pack of Dallas horse thieves." That's about the highest insult you can give them. "And permit me to say it would give me great pleasure to see each of you hanged, each and every one of you, for declaring a murderer guilty only of manslaughter." Now that's very interesting.
But he couldn't change their decision.
No, he couldn't, but he was mad as the deuce about it. But the interesting thing is that Gilchrist, after he got out of prison and served practically the full term.
What was the term for manslaughter?
Well, in that case, he would probably serve at least 15 years for manslaughter, and he went back into the States under an assumed name. Guess how he ends up, his career?
Yeah.
He becomes warden of San Quentin Prison.
Ends up in prison for the rest of his life. What an amazing!
But on the other side.
He knows he could have been
Sure.
executed
Sure.
had things not gone the other way.
Oh, yeah.
Well, did he heap scorn and abuse on the heads of many jurors for their work?
Well, let's take a look at another case. A guy called Matthias Neal. Now, Matthias Neal was a very hard-nosed individual, a lot of natural charm. He's a bit of a scoundrel, and got into a brawl after an all-night card game with a guy in Yale, and the guy took a shot at him, and he missed Neal. And Neal says, "Well, I'm into that game," and he grabs his revolver, chases him around the table, and shoots at him 3 times and kills him. So he's brought up for murder. He's arraigned on this charge. But he comes down in the sternwheeler with Matthew Bailey Begbie. And the interesting thing is that he has supper, a very pleasant conversational supper with Matthew Bailey Begbie. Then he's brought up to trial. And this is a clear case of murder. You know.
Now, it's not self-defense at this point.
Well, it is and it isn't.
Yeah, okay.
But, you know, obviously case of murder. But Begbie passes down a very lenient sentence, 4 years only.
Oh, dear.
Ah.
Yeah. Do we know why? I mean,
Well, we don't know why. You can read the bench notes.
Bailey easily seduced by a fast-talking gambler?
Well, I don't know, but I think he found that there were certain individuals that he kind of liked, and that brings to mind another case, Mike, and that's the Felker case, which took place in Williams Creek or Barkerville. And Felker was a trader in that area, and really a pretty good man. And he went. He got a little. I guess he got into the saloon one night and got in a very violent quarrel with another individual and knifed him. So he was brought to trial, and the jury was impaneled, and the jury consisted of miners on Williams Creek. Yeah. And all these miners got together, and they sat down, and they debated on it after he received instructions from the judge, who was Begbie, that they should find him guilty and so on. They spent 600 seconds, came back with a verdict not guilty.
600 seconds?
Yeah, 600 seconds.
10 minutes to
That's
say.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
That's right. And of course, Begbie was absolutely outraged at this. He thundered at the jury, he thundered at Felker, and bawled them both out, and said to Felker, "Go and sin no more." But in his bench notes, and you can read that, and certainly in Williams's book, he came and he said, "Well, really, you know, The jury are well-respected individuals, and I admire a lot of them. And after all, it was their decision. And then he goes on to mention what he thought of Felker himself. And Felker, he was quite impressed with Felker. And the interesting thing was, Felker never did go off the rails again. He became a very prominent citizen of the Caribou. In fact, the Felkers are still in that Caribou district.
What was his reward for all this? I mean, he obviously brought justice.
Yeah, he was an interesting guy, and he did bring justice, and he was the judge of British Columbia. There's no doubt about that. And he became, of course, he became knighted, and he was knighted in 1875. And here we have a picture of a photograph of Matthew Bailey Begbie, and he's getting ready to receive his investiture. And this is 1875, which is 17 years after he came into British Columbia. So he has reached the pinnacle of his career in 1875, but not the end of it, Mike.
Apart from striking terror in the hearts of horse thieves and murderers and miscreants, did he create anything? I mean, do we owe a system of justice to him, apart from summary justice at the bench?
Well, there's no doubt that he did put his stamp on the judicial system of British Columbia, and that's open to question. But, you know, he was a circuit judge. He went all around British Columbia. He went up into the Cassiar district, up to Laketon. Man was hanged up there as well. He went into the Rock Creek area. He had his circuit judges going into the Wild Horse. He went into the Caribou district. So he went all over, and he rode that circuit, Mike, for 33 years. He was there for a third of a century, pounding those miners' trails and bringing justice into the far-flung camps of British Columbia.
So he did make a contribution.
Oh, sure he did.
I'm going to take a break here because anybody who deals with miscreants in this fashion is obviously going to have a few enemies. We'll talk about some of his enemies right after this break. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. We're addressing the man, Matthew Bailey Begbie, judge and hanging judge. Every time I go to Barkerville, you know, that's one of the things I love to do is go up to the courthouse at Richfield and hear the actors do the cases. I mean, it just puts you into that mood.
Well, let's take a look at this photograph, which is a picture of the old courthouse at Richfield. And there you can see the noose, the actual rope, and the noose is still there, and it stayed there for years, Mike. Nobody touched it, and eventually it disappeared, which is rather a shame. But a lot of his cases were held in the old courthouse in Richfield, which is just above Barkerville, just up Williams Creek. And one of the most famous cases, or perhaps infamous cases, was the so-called Grouse Creek War case. And this was a dispute over two mining companies on some very valuable ground in Williams Creek, and Matthew Bailey Begbie came down with a decision which people really did not like. In fact, the miners on the creek were absolutely livid about it, and there was almost a riot, and 500 or 600 miners were dead set on doing all sorts of things to Matthew Bailey Begbie. In fact, he is sitting up there, he's lying up there asleep one night, and he hears a commotion below him, and he hears some voices. And they're saying there are 3 or 4 miners down below his bedroom window, about 10 feet down in the hotel. And they're saying what they're going to do to Begbie. They're going to beat him up, and they're going to kill him, and they're going to ride him out of town on a rail. And he listens to this for about 2 minutes. He reaches under the bed and takes out the chamber pot, opens the window, and pours it out on top of these guys. End of the conversation, end of the threat. Great guy.
It's very straightforward for me.
Oh, yeah.
Get lost, you guys. That's amazing.
Oh, yeah.
He had enemies.
Oh,
obviously, the miners were not... grudging respect after the little chamber pot issue, but other people were critical of him
Well,
too.
yeah, I think a number of people took dead aim at him. And some of these people were very powerful enemies. There's no doubt about it. Two newspaper editors, John Robson, who became eventually a Premier of British Columbia, was one of, and the editor of the British Columbian newspaper in Newsminster, which was a very, very famous paper in British Columbia. And he was always taking aim at Begbie and his decisions and questioning them. And of course, Amor de Cosmos, who was the editor of the Colonist in Victoria, was also another powerful enemy. And then some other individuals like D.W. Higgins, who wrote a number of books. One was called Mystic Spring, and a number of books which were part fiction and part fact, so that he was never pinned down. And he didn't like Begbie at all.
Was this associated with his decisions and his sort of...
Begbie had an autocratic style. He would brook no interference. He didn't like people to question any of his decisions, whether they were right or wrong. And one of his chief opponents, which was kind of a strange relationship, was with a guy called John McCreight, who is considered one of the two great lawyers in British Columbia. And I think they had a grudging admiration for each other, but McCreight didn't like Begbie as much as Begbie admired McCreight. In fact, in one of Begbie makes a comment in Latin, and he says, "There goes McCreight, the conqueror of all his enemies," because McCreight very seldom lost a case. And at Begbie's death, of course, McCreight had nothing good to say about Begbie, which is rather interesting. And there were some other things which are not brought out generally, or not general knowledge, that certainly he had a very questionable deal, a land deal in a little place called Cottonwoods, which lies between Quesnel and Barkerville. And there was he was certainly involved in that. And there's some rumor still in the Caribou that he had some dealings in some of the mines. And certainly I think that he may have had a silent interest in Billy Barker's original claim, because Billy Barker did get money to carry on from the province. And this is questionable, but it is open to debate, Mike. There's no doubt about it.
It certainly tainted a reputation. Even the rumor tainted the reputation.
Yeah, I think so. I think it did, and I think that he had other flaws. They say that he had a kind of a long-standing affair with a woman called Louisa Bloom. And Louisa Bloom was a very good-looking French woman who came into Victoria in the 1860s, and he knew both her and her husband, who was a haberdasher in Victoria. And the husband died, I think, about 1870, and he continued to see her, even on trips to Paris. And there is some evidence that he was perhaps blackmailed by her, because he
was not married, though.
No, he wasn't married, no.
So this was just in violation of society's requirements, and
yeah,
so she had a hand.
And he was a very prominent member of society. She didn't belong in that category in Victoria, and he eventually left her a bequest of $15,000, which was a considerable sum of money at his death, in 1894.
So these components contribute to what would you not say, he had not a clean record. He had enough conflicts with people so that these components were brought
I think there's some questionable parts of his character, of course, and I think David Williams would probably disagree with me. But he did have other very, very strong points too. He was the creator of the old one of the original organizers of the Union Club in Victoria in 1879. It still stands. He was a very prominent tennis player in Victoria, and was invited to every social gathering that mattered, of course.
This is a shot of him with the great gray beard, actually.
That's right. Old-looking man there, probably taken about 1891.
Did he affect that look? Because you could not ask for a better, somber, steely-eyed look than this.
That's right. He probably did. And he did, as I say, brook no interference at all from anyone. And there were lawyers who simply wouldn't appear before him and had simply resigned because they wouldn't appear before him. And this is by 1894. He dies in 1894. And here's the funeral procession with Matthew Bailey Begbie's body in the hearse.
Remarkable story. I mean, classically trained, comes to the frontier, enacts his form of justice, sets up the province, maintains British interest, hangs a few people. Remarkable story.
Yeah.
Thank you. Matthew Bailey Begbie, the hanging judge, has been our story today, and thank you for watching. My thanks to Bill Barlee, and we'll see you again next time on Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Bye-bye.